What do all these players have in common? Every one of them became a legend during poker's golden era, the stretch when the game exploded across television screens and online sites everywhere. Some of them won millions of dollars overnight, and a few of them became the actual face of the entire boom. Here's the catch, though. Winning the biggest tournament in the world guarantees nothing once the cameras stop rolling. For some of these guys, that win turned out to be the peak, and everything after it fell apart fast. Stick around as we go through what actually happened to these golden era poker legends, starting with the man who kicked the whole thing off, Chris Moneymaker. Chris Moneymaker was working as an accountant in Tennessee back in 2003, playing online poker only in his spare time, and he'd never once sat at a live poker table before qualifying for the World Series of Poker main event through an $86 satellite tournament. Money was so tight that when he landed in Las Vegas, he didn't even have enough to cover the trip, so he ended up selling a piece of himself to his father and a family friend just to pay for travel and a hotel room. What happened over the next several days is the stuff of poker legend, an 839-player field, a bluff against Sammy Farha that's still replayed today, and a walk-away prize of $2.5 million. The effect on the game itself turned out to be even bigger than the win. Because a regular guy with a day job had just beaten a room full of professionals using nothing but an online qualifier, hundreds of thousands of amateurs decided they could do exactly the same thing. And poker rooms everywhere saw entries multiply almost overnight. The industry still calls it the moneymaker effect, and it gets credited as the single biggest catalyst behind the entire poker boom. Moneymaker became a spokesperson for poker stars and walked away from his old life for good, later admitting he didn't even realize how much money he stood to make until his win started airing on television. Here's the thing, though. Unlike a lot of golden era champions, Moneymaker never really faded from view. 2 decades of grinding tournaments followed, and in 2023, he cashed 7 figures for the first time since his main event win, finishing 5th in a $250,000 buy in event in London, then added nearly $1 million more the following year at a Triton event. Along the way, he tried running his own poker rooms too, one outside Dallas and another in Kentucky, though legal trouble with local authorities eventually forced the tables out of the Kentucky location. These days, he mostly plays online as an ambassador for ACR Poker, citing new tax laws that make travel less appealing, but he still shows up for the main event every single summer without fail. At the 2026 WSOP, more than 2 decades after his first appearance, he was still deep enough in the field to bubble the money on day 4, eventually busting out to a warm round of applause from the crowd. Not bad for a guy who once couldn't scrape together enough cash for a hotel room. Up next is Jamie Gold. Jamie Gold's story ranks among the strangest in poker history, mostly because he wasn't even a professional going in. A Hollywood talent agent who'd only been playing tournaments seriously for about a year, Gold got into the game after working alongside former champions Johnny Chan and Chris Moneymaker on a television project, and that connection landed him at the 2006 WSOP main event. The field that year ballooned to a record 8,773 entries, the largest in the tournament's history, and somehow Gold ran through every single one of them without relying on textbook strategy. His whole approach involved talking to opponents at the table, reading their reactions, and needling information out of them, a style plenty of pros hated, but that worked spectacularly well anyway. $12 million is what he walked away with, the biggest first-place prize in poker history at the time, a number that wouldn't be topped for another 6 years. Gold was suddenly everywhere for the next couple of years, appearing on the biggest poker shows on television, signing a sponsorship deal with Bodog, and even landing a spot on high-stakes cash game shows alongside legends like Doyle Brunson. That changed after 2008, when he essentially vanished from public view. Outside of one appearance at a heads-up championship in 2010, Gold barely showed up in recorded tournaments for years, resurfacing only occasionally between 2010 and 2015. A small revival came in 2015 when he cashed for over $120,000 at the WSOP, and he nearly grabbed a ring the following year too, finishing runner-up in a bicycle casino main event for close to $140,000. None of that changed the bigger picture, though, because the man who once won the biggest prize in poker history spent the better part of 2 decades away from the spotlight, splitting his time between occasional poker and running his own entertainment production company. It took until this year, the 20th anniversary of his win, for Gold to really return to the public conversation, showing up as an ambassador for a WSOP crypto partnership and reflecting back on the 2 decades since his win. Total dominance, then near silence, then a quiet late career comeback as an ambassador rather than a player. That's the strange arc of Jamie Gold. Now for a champion whose story took a much darker turn, Jerry Yang. Jerry Yang walked into the 2007 main event about as unknown as a player can get. Fleeing communist forces as a child, Yang spent 4 years in a refugee camp before his family eventually settled in California, and by the time he sat down at that table, he'd only been playing poker seriously for about 2 years, mostly for small stakes at Native American casinos near home. Buy-in money wasn't easy to come by for a father of 6, so he turned a $225 satellite entry into his shot at the main event, then outlasted a field of 6,358 players over 11 grueling days to win $8.25 million. What stood out at that final table wasn't just his play, but his faith, which he credited constantly, telling everyone within earshot that he believed divine help was guiding his cards every time he needed to win a race. That made him one of the most talked about, and, at times divisive, Champions Poker had seen in years. Yang followed through on his word too, giving away a significant chunk of his winnings to charities including the Ronald McDonald House and Make-A-Wish Foundation, and helping out family and friends who'd supported him for years. That generosity is exactly what came back to bite him. "I should have paid my taxes before I made the donations," Yang admitted later, and by the time he tried settling up with the federal government, the financial crisis had already frozen his bank accounts, leaving him unable to cover the bill. $572,000 is roughly what the IRS hit him with in a federal tax lien, and when Yang still couldn't pay, the agency seized his prized possessions outright, including his championship bracelet and the custom watch he'd received at the final table, auctioning both off publicly in 2013. That bracelet, the very symbol of his win, sold for just $30,000 to a memorabilia collector, a fraction of what other champions had gotten for theirs. A sushi restaurant venture back home swallowed even more of his money without ever panning out the way he'd hoped. These days, the man who once turned $225 into a life-changing fortune gets remembered almost as much for his fight with the IRS as for his historic win. Proof that generosity without a financial plan can end up costing just as much as it gives. Next is a champion still grinding 2 decades later, Greg Raymer. Long before anyone called him Fossilman, Greg Raymer worked as a patent attorney holding both a law degree and a master's in biochemistry, squeezing in poker on the side at a casino in Connecticut whenever his job allowed. A $160 online satellite got him into the 2004 main event, and Raymer steamrolled a field of 2,576 players to become just the second champion in a row to come from an online qualifier right after Moneymaker had done the exact same thing 1 year earlier. $5 million is what he took home after beating David Williams heads up, wearing a pair of holographic sunglasses printed with reptile eyes that became one of the most recognizable images of the entire poker boom. His story could have followed the same path as plenty of one-hit champions, but it didn't. Barely 6 months after the win, two men tried forcing their way into his hotel room after a tournament, apparently under the impression he'd be carrying serious cash, and Raymer fought them off and escaped before the attackers were caught and convicted of robbery 6 months later. Instead of letting any of that scare him off, Raymer quit his law career entirely and turned pro full-time, then backed up his win in a huge way the very next year, finishing 25th out of more than 5,600 players in the 2005 main event, one of the most impressive title defenses the tournament has ever seen. What makes Raymer different from a lot of golden era champions who cashed once and disappeared is longevity, and he stayed a fixture on the circuit for over 20 years, racking up more than 60 WSOP cashes and a record 5 Heartland Poker Tour titles along the way. He still turns up at the main event every single summer, and he even busted out of the 2025 edition on a brutal Kings vs. Kings cooler that went viral on its own. Estimates put his net worth anywhere between $5 and $12 million, depending who you ask, and he remains one of the most consistent, well-liked grinders from that entire era. Not every golden era story ends in disaster, and Raymer stands as living proof of exactly that. Up next is a player whose story gets a lot harder to watch, Erick Lindgren. Erick Lindgren, known across the poker world as E-Dog, spent years as one of the most beloved and recognizable faces of the boom, racking up over $10 million in career tournament earnings, holding 2 World Poker Tour titles, and cashing in as a heavily sponsored member of Team Full Tilt, reportedly pulling an estimated $250,000 a month just from his dividend payments as one of the site's public faces. Behind that fame, though, Lindgren was gambling away enormous sums away from the table entirely, mostly through sports betting and fantasy football side action. The floodgates opened in March of 2012 when another well-known gambler posted publicly on a poker forum that Lindgren owed him $11,000 for a fantasy football debt and simply hadn't paid up. Player after player piled onto that same thread, claiming Lindgren owed them money too, and Lindgren himself later admitted his debts had climbed as high as $10 million at one point, on top of an earlier $6 million hole he'd dug years before that. Rehab for gambling addiction followed later that year, an attempt to get a handle on the problem before it consumed him completely. What nobody expected was how much worse things would get once Full Tilt Poker collapsed in April of 2011, cutting off his monthly dividend payments entirely and exposing millions more in debt tied directly to the company. Bankruptcy came in 2012 and again in 2015, with that second filing listing over $8 million in debts against less than $50,000 in actual assets. PokerStars went after him too, suing for $2.5 million tied to old Full Tilt loans, including a duplicate $2 million payment that had been wired into his account by mistake and never returned. None of it pushed Lindgren fully out of the game, though. He kept cashing at the WSOP nearly every single year, even picked up a second career bracelet along the way, and he still turns up occasionally at mid-stakes tournaments today. The image of E-Dog as poker's happy-go-lucky fan favorite is gone for good, replaced by a man who gambled his fortune away not once, but twice over. Now for the two names most poker fans still can't say without getting angry: Howard Lederer and Chris Ferguson. Erick Lindgren's story is about personal debt, but Howard Lederer and Chris Ferguson's story is about something on an entirely different scale. Both men sat as founding board members of Full Tilt Poker, Once the second largest online poker site on the planet, and both had already built massive reputations at the table, with Ferguson winning the main event himself back in 2000 and picking up the nickname Jesus for his long hair and calm demeanor. That changed in September of 2011 when the U.S. Justice Department accused Full Tilt of running what prosecutors literally called a Ponzi scheme, alleging the company owed players around the world $390 million while holding only $59 million on hand to actually cover it. $40 million each is what federal prosecutors claimed Lederer and Ferguson personally collected over a 4-year period, money tied directly to what the complaint described as criminal conduct, while the company as a whole allegedly paid out over $440 million total to board members and owners using player funds. The site collapsed on what the poker world now calls Black Friday, freezing or wiping out money for thousands of players overnight, and both Lederer and Ferguson vanished from public tournaments for close to 6 years afterward. Lederer eventually tried making amends, releasing a public apology in May of 2016 before returning to the WSOP that same summer, and it did not go well. Longtime poker star Daniel Negreanu, once one of Lederer's harshest public critics, admitted he appreciated the apology, though he was still ashamed to see Ferguson show up without ever saying a word about any of it. Lederer met such a cold reception at the tables that he largely retreated from the poker scene again shortly afterward. Ferguson's own return turned out even messier, since he never issued any public apology at all, telling reporters only that he was just here to play poker. Somehow that didn't stop him. Tournament after tournament, Ferguson kept grinding, and in 2017 he actually won the WSOP Player of the Year award, an achievement that left a huge portion of the poker community absolutely furious. Even now, bringing up either man's name at a poker table is enough to start an argument, a permanent stain on two players who once helped build the biggest online poker company on earth. Finally, let's close things out with a legend whose story is really about survival, Scotty Nguyen. Scotty Nguyen, the self-proclaimed Prince of Poker, ranks among the most iconic figures the game has ever produced. Fleeing Vietnam as a child during the war, Nguyen spent time in Taiwan before finding a host family in the United States, got expelled from school for spending too much time in underground poker games, then worked as a card dealer at Harrah's in his early 20s, grinding low stakes on the side. That grind eventually turned him into a 5-time WSOP bracelet winner, most famously taking down the 1998 main event with a legendary bit of trash talk at the final table.
You call, gonna be all over, baby.
You call, it's gonna be all over, baby, a line poker fans still quote to this day. A $50,000 HORC championship joined his resume in 2008, making him the only player in history to win both that title and the main event. And by 2013, he'd been inducted into the Poker Hall of Fame, calling it something his own grandkids would talk about one day. Nguyen stood as one of the most accomplished and beloved players of his entire generation, at least by every measure that mattered. Underneath the charisma, though, Nguyen battled a serious drug addiction for years, and it slowly ate away at his game and his finances at the same time. His results on the felt began sliding, his once sharp instincts dulled, and by 2012, he'd filed for bankruptcy. Plenty of players on this list tried hiding their struggles from the public, but Nguyen's decline played out fairly openly within the poker world, and it was hard for a lot of longtime fans to watch happen in real time. He's kept a much lower profile ever since, focusing on getting help for his addiction and slowly rebuilding his life away from the spotlight. These days, he's said to spend time on advocacy work, sharing his own experience with addiction to help others going through the exact same thing. he'll probably never reclaim the same prominence he once held at the tables. But Scotty Nguyen's story runs deeper than just a cautionary tale about fame and excess. Even the biggest legends in this game are still just people underneath it all, and the ones who manage to claw their way back deserve just as much respect as the ones who never fell in the first place. Thanks for watching, everyone, and we'll see you in the next one.